Guys, Kenny Wisdom here with another Trainer Tip Tuesday, and today we're going to talk about consistency in deck building. For those of you who don't know, a deck being consistent means that it accomplishes what it wants to do more often than not, and has a pretty easy time doing it. What this translates to in game is, let's say, your Rayquaza deck hitting a turn 240 most of the time. You built the Rayquaza deck to do just that. That is the primary objective of the deck, and the more often you can do that, the better. And how we accomplish consistency is by narrowing down exactly what it is we want our deck to do. A very common mistake by new players is that they'll get into the game and they'll make a deck with, 10 different stage 1 lines or 6 stage 1 lines and a couple stage 2 lines and a handful of trainers just because they want to be prepared for everything and they want to have options against whatever they face. Well, this isn't exactly always bad. I strongly believe that when putting together a deck, you should be very aware of what the deck is trying to do and really set out to do just that. So, in the Rayquaza EX example above, since that's a pretty popular card, we want to get at Rayquaza and we want to do as much damage as fast as possible. And then we have to think about what kind of cards do we need to do this. Well, we need Rayquaza, and we need the Mega Rayquaza, and we need to find a suitable number of those to make sure we can play it as early as possible and as often as possible. And then the same can be said for a handful of other cards, what I like to call the skeleton of your deck, which for the Rayquaza deck is something like Rayquaza, Mega Rayquaza, Shaman EX, Double Colorless Energy, Skyfield, Mega Turbo, Rayquaza Spirit Link. I'm sure there's a few others, but those, you get what I'm saying. Those are kind of the main ones that specifically go exactly into the other Rayquaza deck. There are cards like, let's say Ultra Ball, for instance, that go in every deck and are staples dependent on the format, but that's not really what we're talking about there, although those cards do play a very big role in making your deck consistent. So, everyone will have a different way to build a deck. Every good player, every bad player, every new player, every old player, every player will tell you they have a different way that they construct their decks or they test their decks. But what I personally like to do is I like to take every card that I might play in the deck, so every card that I need and every card that I want, and then I put 4 of them in the original deck list. And as you can tell, this probably ends up being around 80 or 90 cards, and that's totally fine. And then from there, once I have that 90 card list, then I start trimming things down. I start looking at, firstly, I start looking at what are the cards that I don't really need. Do I need 4 Lysander? No, obviously not. Do I need 4 Juniper? Okay, probably. Do I need 4? And no, I can cut that down a little bit. And what the key is here is you want to cut all the cards first that aren't part of your main engine. So those are Rayquazas, those Shamans, etc. It's very likely that you will end up cutting some of those cards. Very few decks run 4 Rayquaza, 4 Shaman, 4 Spirit Link, 4 Skyfield. But you definitely want to be able to get rid of the stuff that's not necessary first, and then start cutting into your main cards. And actually, something that's really important to note that I'm not sure how many people do anymore. I think it kind of depends on how you test and who you grew up in the game around, but I think it's totally fine to play 61 or 62 cards for testing. Obviously, it's going to change a few things. Your draws aren't going to be perfect. It's going to mess up a little bit with that, but I would much rather be able to play a 62 card deck 10 times and try out basically both ideas, whatever card you want to be, whatever of the 3 cards that you want to be your last card, try out all those ideas at once, than to stick to a very rigid deck building process and then have to spend more time doing that. And I don't really think there's much of a downside to just putting 62 or 63 cards in your deck. Obviously, at some point you're going to need to cut that down and decide on a list, but I think if you can't decide between 2 or 3 cards, I would definitely go with that. And so now we're back and we have our 62 card deck, let's say, and cutting down to 60 cards is the absolute hardest part. No one gets it right the first time, and even the best players in the world will tell you that they will not build a deck absolutely optimally the first time. It takes testing, and it takes understanding, it takes experience, and you're going to have a hard time until you have that experience. And once you do, things come more naturally. For instance, once you have experience, even in just a certain format, you can say, okay, I know that I want 4 Juniper, 4 Versus Seeker, and kind of start from there. But you definitely you have to learn that somewhere, and it can take a very long time. And so What the most important part to recognize here is what you can and can't live without. Going back to that skeleton, in our list above, we definitely need Rayquaza and Shaman. Those are the two that we cannot live without in order for our deck to function. Um, and like I said, no one is important. It's largely trial and error. It takes experience, which is why playtesting is so important. And we'll definitely be getting to a playtesting episode soon because I kind of feel like these topics run hand in hand. But yeah, so definitely you want to make your deck as consistent as possible. Have your deck do something. Make sure that you understand what it is your deck wants to do and then try and maximize on that by playing as many copies of those cards as possible. So if your deck needs a tropical beach on turn 1 and 2 and expanded, play 4 tropical beaches. If tropical beach is something that your deck likes but doesn't need that much, play just one of them. If your deck this is actually an important piece too, speaking of stadiums, is that one thing that's really important about stadiums is that, say Skyfield, for instance. Skyfield is a card that requires a deck needs. It's part of the skeleton. It doesn't necessarily rely on having it out all the time, but most lists are playing a high number, somewhere around 2 or 3, because the stadium will eventually get knocked out of play. It will get discarded out of your hand. So that's a whole other thing you need to think about is, when can I sacrifice this? Is everyone playing 4 Verbank? Well, then I better play a lot of my stadium because my stadium's going to get bumped more often. So just something to think about. All of this, like I said, takes a lot of practice, takes trial and error. No one's perfect at it, and when you're building a deck, you really need to first and foremost have a clear idea of what's going on, and then have the time to perfect the list and test it. So playtesting episode coming up soon. As I said, these kind of go hand in hand, so I like to get that out of the gate as soon as possible. But let me know what you'd like to see in the upcoming editions of Trainer Tip Tuesday, and whatever comment gets the most likes, I will go ahead and do that one for next week. My name is Kenny Wisdom, and thank you for watching.